I can't see the screen yet.
All right, give it time, Jens. And for those who are chiming in afterward, this is the lecture from 331 for BUS 235. Janice, it looks like you're good to go now, right? Bella, can you see the screen? Jess?
Yeah, I can see the screen now. Thank you.
Luca, can you see it? Got it. Okay, so we're all good. All right. Thomas, you can't, really, Mr. Purvis? You can't see it on a good day, bro. Just messing with you, just messing with you. All right. So, all right, so let's move forward, right, before I get fired for making fun of Tom, right? Okay. So what we're going to look at today are three things, basically. We're going to start with the new layout of the course. Then we're going to look at project 3. And then we're going to look at what's coming up, and then we're going to do the lectures for that particular quiz. Okay? So here's where we are, and I'm going to mute everybody else because if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll put it up on the other screen there. Okay? So let me mute everybody. And there we go. All right, so if you have a question, just type it in, and I'll acknowledge it, and we'll go through there. So let's take a look here at the first thing on the agenda, right? Welcome, Jared. So first thing we're going to do is a new layout. Now, I am not going to change the layout on the side for you, okay? Instead, we're going to leave that here, and we're going to put this up here as well. So each of these buttons at the bottom represent the modules that you see on the left. So if I click the module, this would be it. And I put the chime, the class lectures, start here, so on and so forth under each one of them. And so if you click each one of them, like today we're going to be looking at leading, it will pull up the overview and so on and so forth, and you can come right there. So it's a little bit easier way to navigate. And as we are going to be online for the summer, at least for the summer, possibly even summer 2, I want to make sure that this is actually going to work. So what I'd like for you to do is, as you're moving through this, play around with it, try out this new layout for me, and see if the buttons at the bottom work better than everything else. Because the way it works right now, if I'm clicking on here, sometimes you don't know exactly what it is that we're looking for, and I can then have each one of the modules on the screen at the same time, and it makes it a little bit easier. So this is one of the ways that the instructional design team has given me that might work for us. So I just wanted to go over that with you. Now, for your class, you can still come down to the sides over here, right? And still pull each one of these pieces up. And so the next thing we want to do is let's go ahead and take a look at project 3, which is under assignments here, right? So we look at project 3. Your network diagram is going to be due on April 5. And I have given you the instructions we'll go back to in just a moment, but let me tell you what I want you to do. I want you to take the practice projects, and I want you to create a network diagram and a Gantt chart for your group's project. And we're still working in groups as best we can, so I want you to do it for your group's project. Only one of you need to turn it in, and everybody will get credit for that. Okay? All right. So Jared asked the question, are we going to be online for summer sessions number 1? The answer is yes, right? So let's, for anything we're doing right now, let's talk about that. But let's take the general questions and we'll save them for the end of class. Okay, so that makes it a little bit easier for everybody else who's watching online. All right, so with that in mind, let's go back to our assignments. And I'll show you what I mean by the network diagram and the Gantt chart. So for the network diagram, okay, I showed you how to do this in class, and I put the lectures there. I will go ahead and put a link here at the end to show you how to do that as well. For practice project 2, or 3.2, the Gantt chart, I've given you your practice project assignment, and I created a video for you, okay? So a couple of you are like, okay, well, I didn't see how to do that. Here's the answer, and here's how you get that done. Got it? All right. So with that in mind, do we have any questions about that particular assignment, like practice project and the project 3 that's due on April 5? Okay. All right.
Actually, yes. Do you put comments in the feedback of it or in the comments box for projects?
So I do both. So if I go to the assignment, let's pick the one that you've already turned in, right? Go to speed grader. Okay. So for the hotel industry, you guys did a good job on that. And because you didn't have any changes, I didn't add any comments to it. But generally, let's say, for instance, I were to tell you, okay, let's find something, right? All right. So, for instance, I would put something like this here. I'll make that green because that's a good comment. That's what we want, right? Okay. Okay. Scrolling down, right? We take a look. Okay. And, all right. Something like that. All right. And then I'll put something in the comments like keep up the good work. Like this. Okay. When I submit that, now you can then go back and you can take a look at the annotations. So when you pull up your thing, you'll say there'll be a spot up here at the right that says annotations. That's how you pull up these comments. And then the assignment comments will be general comments about the overall thing. Make sense? Does that answer your question, Cole?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, so one more time, right? Let's go back. I hate that it does that. Okay, let's go back and look at project management. All right, and we will take a look at the assignments. Practice project 3.1 and 3.2 show you how to do the network diagram and Gantt chart. Okay, now with that in mind, I will also go and I will find, while I'm right here, let me edit this. And I will put in oh, you know what? That's on, actually, let me come over here and get the link from YouTube and I'll put it on there because I forgot that I put them on YouTube. Sometimes Joe forgets, you got to understand, all right? So, okay, so, all right. So this is the class lecture from March 26th. And it shows, okay. Courtney, was that what you were asking me to put up?
Yeah, I was present for the network diagram, but I wasn't for the Gantt chart.
Got you. Okay. And so if you go to practice project 3.2 for the Gantt chart, there's the video on how to do that.
Perfect.
Good job. Okay, good job. All right. All right. So, all right. So we've done the new layout. We've talked about how to do the practice projects, right? Now let's talk about your quiz coming up. Okay. That next quiz is going to be due on Sunday. And today and Thursday, we're going to talk about what it is you need to know for the quiz. So I'm going to go over the lectures with you. If we can get through it, fine. If not, then I'll push the due date for the quiz back. Okay. But I think we can get through it. There's only 3 slides and they're relatively short. 3 slide decks and they're relatively short.
Is it all multiple choice?
It is, right?
Wait,
So for this quiz, it's all multiple choice. Ask that question again, please.
Quiz number 3, can you hear me first of all?
Yes.
Quiz number 3 is due on April 5th, but that's a Sunday, so what would be the day we're going to do it?
You're going to do it between Friday and Sunday. I'm going to open it up on Friday, and then you have until Sunday to complete it.
Gotcha.
Got it? Okay. Any other questions about that?
No, I'm good for now.
Okay. All right. So, shouldn't be that difficult, honestly. This one was one that most folks did well on. So with that in mind, let's come over and we will go to our leading module. And we're going to look at leading under risk management. It's a very topical conversation. Now, we talked a little bit about this before we all left, right? But I want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Oh. Okay. All right, can everyone see? Y'all good? Jared,
Yeah.
can you see it? Good, okay. All right, so today we're going to talk about risk management, right? And it's kind of a misnomer that you can manage risk. Management is something that is where you can control the resources and whatever, but at some point you have to think, okay, there is a risk, we have to figure out what we're going to do about it. And the idea between all of this is we're going to analyze that risk, okay? So the top across, the top is how you do it strategically. You're going to identify, assess, and analyze. And then the bottom is what the tactics are to deal with it, the reducing, the transferring, and controlling. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So here's where we are in the process, right? So last time we talked about project networks. Now we're looking at risk management. So we come down here, we're thinking about risk management as a tool for us to be able to pull all of this together, okay? So when we're done, what we should be able to do are these learning objectives, right? You can take a look at those at your leisure, right? The one thing that I want to change here is number 4, where it says the 4 responses to risk management. There are now 5, and we'll go over that in just a moment, okay? So, and here is the outline for what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, all right? So let's talk about the risk management process. Now, the first thing that we need to think about is what is a risk, okay? There's a difference between risk and uncertainty. And a risk is something that planning cannot overcome or control. Uncertainty is you don't know what you don't know. Risk is we do know, we just can't see it. And so we can't deal with it at this moment. So risk management so that we can understand how it's going to be fixed or how we can implement our strategy for overcoming that risk. So we think about what can go wrong. We think about how do we minimize the risk event's impact? What are the consequences, right? What can we do before the event occurs? And what are some contingency plans that we develop as we go through, okay? All right, so what you see now is what's called the event graph or the risk event graph, right? And so one of the things that I want to point out to you, if I can make this work, right, is the fact that as we increase, well, I didn't mean to do that, right? So as we increase the time across the project lifecycle, so in the defining and planning phases, as we move through the project lifecycle, the chances of the risk event occurring go down. Think of this like the cone on the graph that you've seen for the hurricanes, right? The closer you get to it actually striking land, the less likely it is to actually strike you. So what I mean by that is that cone of uncertainty goes down, therefore the chances of the hurricane hitting are less. It's the same thing with risk management. So when you are moving from left to right through the defining and planning phases, you can see that you have a pretty flat curve here. So the risk event occurring is high. The chances of something going wrong are relatively high here. But the closer you get to actually delivering, the lower the chance it actually happens. So the probability goes down through this area. However, the cost to fix it if it goes wrong increases, right? So even though the probability goes down, the cost to fix it will increase. And that's one of the reasons why, as you look at all of these flattening the curve graphs and things like that, that all of the health experts are trying to get everybody to stay indoors because they're trying to reduce the likelihood. Because the longer it takes, the more costly it's going to be in human lives, in capital, in lost wages, in jobs, and everything else. So as you move through this project, you want to try your best to reduce the amount of time between yourself and the risk event so that the probability goes down. This is one of the reasons why we spend so much time in the defining and planning phases over here as well, right? The faster we get through these phases, the quicker we can reduce the likelihood. Make sense? Okay. Now, one of the things that we want to do is take a proactive rather than a reactive approach. We want to try to think about the consequences of those actions and so that we can reduce them before they actually come to pass. All right? So this allows us to take advantage of the appropriate risk and actually use some of those things as we move through. We also have better control over the future events if we can develop a proper response before the event happens. The biggest reason why that we want to practice good risk management is because it allows us to improve our chances of actually reaching the project performance goals, making sure we do it on time and under budget. Now, with that in mind, there are 4 steps that we do, right? The first thing is identify the risk, then we assess the risk, then we develop a response, and we control for the risk, okay? So step 1, identify the risk. Step 2, assess the risk. Step 3, risk response. Step 4, risk control. Now, in the identification phase, this is where we want to analyze any potential sources, and the risk assessment is where we look at the impact. Risk response is where we develop a strategy, and in risk response is where we're really going to get into the meat of the whole thing. And then in step 4, this is where we implement that strategy. So let's take a look at step 1. The way we identify the risk is we think of all the possible things that could go wrong. We identify them and we give them a risk profile. And that risk profile is a combination of the probability and the detrimental effects, or the cost, if you will. Then we use the risk breakdown structure together with the work breakdown structure so that we can then say this is what's going to happen or what could possibly happen, right? So for instance, Cole, your team is building a website for the hotel and building an online presence for a hotel, and I think that's absolutely phenomenal. What is one of the risk events that you have identified?
One of the risk events we have identified is trying to make sure that we can properly get the website up where it is real enough, but it's going to be obvious to the public to actually where people aren't actually going to make a mistake booking and think it's that. So where it looks real enough to actually complete the project of professional, but manage the risk where somebody's not going to book it and then try to sue us thinking it's a real hotel that they didn't do the research on.
Gotcha, I understand. Now, so one of the other risks might be that the website doesn't work, right? Or in your case, you were talking about we end up getting sued because at the end of the day, people think this is real. So this is a list of possible risks, right? And you brainstorm through that.
Yes.
So let's take a look at the risk profile. What happens if that does actually occur? Like, what's the cost to you if that does actually occur?
Actually registered the website under the school's name, so they're the ones responsible.
Okay. So
I have no cost to it because it's technically registered.
But what would happen if someone actually does book that hotel?
I would have to reach out to them and tell them that this is not a real hotel.
Maybe. What happens if they then turn around and say, so you identified the risk as they're going to sue us. So give me a number, a dollar figure that you figure will be, okay, this is what it's going to cost us.
For the risk, maybe between legal fees, the money they're losing on the money, I would guess it could be up to $5-6 grand.
Okay, so let's say $6,000. Okay, what is the actual probability of that occurring?
Probably low, especially because right now nobody's really booking any hotels.
Okay, so nobody's booking any hotels, right? Nobody's moving, and they're probably not going to be looking for your particular hotel. They'll be looking for other stuff. So you put all that together, give me a probability.
Like 1 to 100 or
Yes.
percent?
How much?
A percentage or a number?
Yes, percentage.
I would say maybe like less than 5%.
So let's use 5% because it makes the math easy. Okay? So you take the 5%, you multiply it by the $6,000 you said would occur, and therefore the cost of that risk would be about 30 bucks. Right? No, it'd be 300 bucks.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so that's how you do that. Now that's what the risk profile is. We'll go through that in just a moment, and we'll see how that works. When you're actually looking at this, you're going to have, let's say for this particular structure, this would be a risk breakdown structure that mirrors the work breakdown structure for the last project that we looked at. So you've got your technical, your external, your organizational, and your project management, right? Technical risks, right? Maybe the requirements don't get met. Maybe the technology is not there yet, so on and so forth. External risk, right? Subcontractors don't come through. Regulatory bodies tell us that we can't get the job done, right? The market doesn't bear it out. The customers don't want it. Weather, hurricanes coming, right? You could add another one down here that says COVID-19, right? Then in your organizational and your project management, what happens if we screwed up? What happens if we don't do this right? Or what happens if the organization doesn't like it, right? Okay. Hey, if you're going to chew chips, please turn your microphone off. Okay. All right. So now, how do we look at this? We look at we just ask questions. We ask what if questions, right? So we think about how can each one of these develop as we move forward. Now, how do we do this? The next thing is to assess the risk. And this is where I was talking about we take that probability. So we look at the probability and the impact. The impact is always going to be in a dollar figure. Probability is always going to be in a percentage figure, okay? Impact is in dollars, probability is in percentage. And then you put it together into a risk severity matrix, which gives you FMEA. That's called the failure, mode, and effects analysis. What happens if it fails, and what will the effects be? And then you can assign a risk value, right? Which would be the impact times the probability times detection. So I'm going to stop right there, and I'm actually going to put in for us the very thing that you said. So we have our risk value here, right? So Cole said that the impact to that would be about 6,000, right? Times the probability of 0.05. What is the probability that you can actually detect it?
Like 100% because I'll be able to see the bookings on the platform.
So you would be able to detect that then, right?
I mean, assuming I check it, if I didn't go checking it, but I probably would check it, yeah, while it's still published.
Right, so you put all that together, and then what then becomes the risk value for this? $300, okay? Make sense? All right, so while I've got this up, right, and we're all looking at it together, a couple of questions came through, right? One of was, Tom asked, would costs be financial as well as the overall effect of the project? So yes, you would look at the financial project, and then you'll understand as you're moving through the project that that's going to increase as we move through. So the overall effect or impact on the project will increase. If you detect someone trying to log in now, for example, you can almost 100% guarantee that you're going to be able to detect that. But if it's like at the last minute, right, okay, then you'll not be able to do that, all right? And so Mike asked, does anyone know when the 15 days to flatten the curve is going to end? And the answer is, I do not know. I do know that President Trump came out and said that it's probably going to be the end of April, beginning of May, before we can even begin thinking about getting back to normal. Okay? All right, so with that in mind, let's continue on. Yes.
So for the detection and the probability for the risk, that's determined by your group, I guess. And
yes, and so this is going to be, I'm sorry, let me listen to your question.
So I was just saying for the detection and the probability, that would obviously be determined by whoever's in charge of the project.
Not just who's in charge, it's who's in charge of each section of the project. So for instance, it may be that you're in charge of one section and another person's in charge of another. So if you're in charge of the budget, one of the risks might be we're not going to have enough money.
Okay.
If they're in charge of the technical requirements, it might be we don't know what the hell we're doing. Right? So you get together as a group and identify these. Right?
Okay.
Another way you can do that is through decision trees and net present value formulas and things of this nature. You've already learned about NPV. You'll learn more about that in BUS 311, and you'll learn more about decision trees in BUS 322. All right, so as we move forward, one of the ways that we can put this all together is looking at what the negative impacts of each one of the pieces will be. And so what we have here is a Likert scale that goes 1 to 5, with 1 being a very low impact and 5 being a very high impact. And generally, as you can see, the relative scales or numerical scales that we gave these allow us to be able to look at each of the pieces in conjunction with one another. So for instance, we look at the cost, and if we rate that as very low, then that would be an insignificant cost increase, right? However, as Cole pointed out with his, that's about a $6,000 hit if you do end up getting sued. So that would be a very high relative scale. So that's something that you really need to pay attention to, right? If you're building a balsa wood bridge, and can everybody still hear me?
Yeah, I get.
Okay.
You just cut out for like 30 seconds.
Okay. Okay, so if you drop the bridge and break it, then that would be a very high impact, and the cost of that would be very, very high, right? Okay. Okay. All right, so, all right. There we go. Now, you look at this risk assessment form, and now you look at this as the risk event. You look at the likelihood and the impact, the detection difficulty. So an interface problem, probably pretty high. So let's say we were building a new interface for a computer system, right? The interface would be, it's very high. It's like a 40%. Impact on a scale of 1 to 10 is a 4. Detection difficulty, kind of high. And so that's something that we need to think about. System freezing, not very likely, but if it does happen, that's a huge problem, right? Users don't like it, okay? Not a very high impact. Or what if the hardware malfunctions? That's a very high impact too. So when you put all of that together, you have a scale of 1 to 5 on the impact, and you have a scale of 1 to 5 on the likelihood. And when you add them all together, the impact by the probability by the detection gives you your risk value. So which of these areas do you think that you should be looking at first? The red, the yellow, or the green?
Red.
Yes, right? So you look at the red first. Now in the red, which do we look at first, interface or system freezing?
Well, you'll probably see system freezing first.
Why?
Because you can't look at interface problems if the system's frozen.
So let's look at the impact across the bottom, right? And what's the score for impact on the system freezing?
10.
Right, so 5 by 2 is a 10, right? When you look at the interface problem, it's 4 by 4. What's 4 times 4?
16.
So which one should you look at first?
Interface.
Interface? Exactly, because it has a higher score. See? So that's the easy part, right? And then the next thing you look at is still staying within the red because you've identified that as the high risk. Then you look at system freezing. Then you look at user backlash, and finally hardware malfunction. Okay? Once you've done all of that, you're going to come up with, and this is the part where I said we were going to add another one, right? So this is where you look at each one of your processes and you say, okay, how are we going to deal with this? So mitigating the risk is just reducing the likelihood, right? Avoiding the risk is we're going to change the plan to eliminate that risk or condition. Transferring is we're going to pay a premium to another party, and then accepting the risk is it is what it is, all right? Now, with that in mind, we're going to come down here and I'm going to add another one, right? Oh, didn't mean to do that. Add another one down here, and we're going to, right, exploit. Exploit the risk, okay? Okay, so we're going to now exploit the risk, and that exploitation does not necessarily mean a bad thing. So let's look at a hurricane, right? We did this before we left, but let's look at a hurricane. What would mitigating for a hurricane look like? So how would we reduce the likelihood of a hurricane hurting us?
I don't know, like gathering supplies beforehand, maybe?
Right, so you gather your supplies beforehand. What else do you do? What else do you do to your house before the hurricane gets there?
Put shutters up on the windows.
Put up the shutters, right? So all of those reduce the impact of the adverse event. It does not reduce the probability that it's going to occur, but it does reduce the impact. As a matter of fact, in the state of Florida, if the insurance company finds out you had shutters and you did not put them up, they have the legal right to cancel your claim because you could have mitigated the risk and you chose not to. Okay, the next one, avoiding the risk. This is changing the plan to eliminate the risk or the condition, right? So we're going down, still hurricane coming. How do we change the plan to eliminate the risk, right? One of the things we can do is say, instead of building our call center in Florida, we're going to build it in Georgia, right? Transferring the risk. This is paying a premium. This is insurance. We buy insurance to transfer the risk or the adverse effects to someone else. We pay them money. They provide us with insurance, and therefore they are the ones who take the risk. And finally, accepting the risk. We're just going to make a conscious decision to accept that risk. Okay? Now, exploit the risk. And y'all let me misspell that word, didn't you? Just sat right there and let me misspell. All right? We're going to exploit the risk. What does exploitation of the risk look like? This is when you use it to your advantage. Okay? Right now, there are companies out there that are going to be making a lot of money because of this idea that they can exploit the risk. Let's take something simple that we can all wrap our brain around. We're in the middle of this COVID-19 virus, right? So we're all staying at home, right? Right? We're all staying at home, right? Okay, so we still got to eat. Publix has now made it where if you will stay at home, they will deliver your groceries to you. It may take 2 or 3 days, but they'll get it to you. And they'll leave it on the outside of your house, send you a message on your phone and says, hey, we delivered your groceries. And now you go out and you get them and everybody's satisfied. Target's doing that. Jimmy John's is doing that. Jersey Mike's is doing it. All of the delivery foods are doing that. Domino's Pizza is so busy right now that they can't get enough people to deliver pizza, right? So that is all a way of exploiting the risk. So one person's loss is always another person's gain. Transferring the risk, you pay a premium to the insurance company. The insurance company makes money off of that, okay? All right. So another way that you can do that, other than just risk response development, you can also come up with a contingency plan. The contingency plan is what happens if the event does occur? What happens if we have a possible unforeseen risk or a risk that we can foresee that actually occurs? What are we going to do if a hurricane hits? What are we going to do if COVID-19 shuts down our business, right? And so this is just a plan of action that reduces or mitigates the negative impact. My contingency plan for a hurricane, right? Make sure the shutters are put up. Make sure that we have plenty of food and water. Make sure we have plenty of gas. Make sure that we have plenty of medications, so on and so forth. And then finally, last resort is we haul ass and we get out of here, right? Okay. Hurricane comes, what do? You grab your beer and you run. So now, why do we have to do that? Because if you don't have it, you're going to be very, very slow in responding, right? Also, and I think you all will agree with me, decisions made under pressure can be potentially dangerous and very costly, right? Decisions made under pressure can be potentially dangerous and very costly. All right, so what you do is you put this all together into this thing called a risk response matrix, okay? That will be, what is the risk event? Who's going to be responsible for it? Or what's the response going to be? So if we have an interface, we're going to mitigate that by testing the prototype. If that doesn't work, then we're going to work around until help comes. We're going to do a workaround. And then if it's not solved within 24 hours, we're going to come up and we're going to say, hey, Niles, you need to figure this out, right? You broke it, okay? All right, so let's look at some of the technical risk and the scheduling risk. Different types of risk are what we're looking at now. So the first is going to be technical risks, right? Technical risks are those that we look at if we have a backup if the technology fails, right? Things don't work. What happens if Chime doesn't work? What are we going to do to get around that? What happens is, in the case with my BUS 322 class, I have 4 students who do not have the data analytics toolpack because they're using only an iPad. So I got to come up with a better plan. How do we deal with, okay, Joe can't meet you face to face, so, right, we're going to have to come up with another one. That then becomes our scheduling risk, right? So our schedule risk is, we're going to look and say, what happens if we have to finish the project late? Can we look at duration dates or times where we say we have to finish this project by a certain date, right? We can compress the schedule on the front end so that we have more slack on the back end, right? In other words, don't wait till the last minute. So these are things that we can do. Now, our cost risks and our funding risk, they are 2 different things. Cost risk and funding risk are not the same thing, okay? Cost risk and funding risk are not the same thing, all right? Okay. Now, a cost risk is when the cost will increase and the problems take longer to solve. Costs are increasing and the problems take longer to solve, all right? Now, that doesn't mean, so that means we have a finite amount of money and the costs go up. We have to figure out a way to cover that. So let's say, for instance, we budgeted $10,000 for the project and we realize halfway through that it's going to take us $12,000. The cost is going up and our money did not, so we got to figure out a way to come up with that extra $2,000. The funding risk is the inverse of that. We get through, like, say, 50% of the project, and we look and we say, okay, the cost is going to stay the same, but now we only have $8,000. And as a result, the changes in the supply of funds have dried up. And so we're not going to be able to finish it. Either way, we still have to come up with extra money. The difference is with the cost risk, the cost increases. With the funding risk, the amount of money decreases. Okay? So far, so good? All right. Okay. All right. Now, when we were talking about exploiting, right? This is where we come in with opportunity management. Everybody's risk is someone else's opportunity. One person's risk is someone else's opportunity. And so what we want to do in exploiting that risk is we want to try to eliminate the uncertainty. We want to come up with a better plan. We also want to be able to share that risk across the board with everybody else. And we want to think about how can we come up with a share of ownership so that everybody can take a little piece of the action, right? This is how corporations got started. So sharing the risk is how corporations got started way back in the day when the kings and queens were ruling Europe. Rather than sending a lone ship and one person taking all the risk, they would take a pool of money and each person would put in and buy shares in the company, and they would cooperate in the risk event. Hence the term corporation, right? So what they did is they allocated each piece, and then they were able to take that and benefit from the project. You also want to be able to enhance it, right? Maybe, like for instance, if you can enhance that, you can say, okay, maybe we are really good, like FP&L, for example, right? They are really good at risk response when it comes to getting your lights turned back on. So as a result of that, they are able to go through the process and think, hey, we can now turn that around and help other people, right? And then finally, you can accept it. It is what it is. We're going to take it for what it's worth, and we're going to move forward, okay? Two other plans that you can have are contingency plans and time buffers. So a contingency plan is just a budget reserve or a management reserve. It says we got extra money in the bank in case something goes wrong. It's also extra funds that go above and beyond, and they've been identified by somebody else outside of your team. All right, a time buffer is the equivalent of that, but on time. All right, so let me get through this and then I'll answer your question, right? So the time buffer is when we use the time to compensate for unplanned delays in the project. You got me? All right, do we have a question? Okay. All right. Okay. All right, so let's get back to where we were, all right? Okay. Now, the next step you take, the fourth step you take in this is called the risk response control. What you've done so far is you've identified the risk, you've laid out a plan, you've given risk management strategies, and now you're going to control for that, right? So the controlling is, let's make sure that we stay on budget and make sure we stay on task for the risk that we're looking at. And this requires monitoring, forecasting, repeating the identification process, putting all this back together and making sure that we run through the process one more time, okay? Now, sometimes we have to make changes. Sometimes we have to pivot. We're in the middle of that right now, so you fully understand that, right? Sources of the change might be, project scope. You have to implement your plan. Improvements. Sometimes people come along and say, hey, I want you to change this, right? Sometimes it's a virus that nobody's ever heard of and it shuts down everything. Sometimes it's a hurricane. All of those things are risk events. And so the sources of that change might come from any of these, right? How do you deal with that? First thing you do is you identify the proposed changes. Then you look through and you say, okay, what are the effects? How do we evaluate it? How do we communicate that to others? Who's going to be responsible? So on and so forth. This slide here is kind of what I want you to look at. When you have a change process or a change control process in place, it looks like a flow chart. And this flow chart allows you to go from one event to the next, okay? So let's say Joe calls an audible and Joe says, I'm going to change it. I'm going to make whatever, okay? If I wanted to change the student learning outcomes for this class and say, look, it's just too much on us, I'm going to back off of that. I would have to submit that to my supervisor for approval. They would then review it, and if they approved it, we would update the plan, and then we would distribute that out. If they did not, I'd have to go back and redo the change request, right? Now, so far, it's been a relatively easy process. We just snap and we go through it. Everything seems to be working out, okay? All right. Now, the benefits of that is that little things don't, it's just discouraged. Inconsequential things, that's not that important, right? The implementation can be easily monitored. We can allocate our budget and our management, so on and so forth, and we pull that through, okay? Now, this change request This is something that you can take a look at on your own. This is what a sample of it might look like. When we're looking at the request log, these are all the changes that have been made throughout the entire process, okay? And then finally, we look at some of the key terms that we need to know, all right? Now, the rest of this is just a simulation that we're not going to take a look at, right now. I don't need you to actually know that stuff, all right? All right, so Courtney, I see that you came and went several times here. Is there anything that you need me to go back over for you? Is there anything that anybody else needs me to go over for them? Right? Do you have any questions, comments, or concerns?
Hey Joe, is when you're talking about exploiting the risk, is that not only looking at how your project can kind of exploit the risk, but also like the competitors and people around you?
Yes, absolutely. You look at the competitors and others around you as well. So one of the reasons why the iPhone continually changes and evolves over time is because if the iPhone did not change, then Samsung would take advantage of that, right? And so they would come up with a better product. If in the looking at the COVID-19 response, okay, the fact that some of the delivery and carry-out places are doing so well is a testament to the fact that the other restaurants are being shut down. Does that make sense? So one person's risk is another person's exploitation. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have a question?
I do, but it's not about the assignment, so I'll wait until anyone else does.
Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions about lecture number 7 on risk management? So let's concentrate on that for now.
Why did no slides have stars in them? Usually put stars with stuff we need to know.
Yes, sir. We'll go back and do that again on Thursday. Okay.
Okay.
I'll make sure when I put together the study guide, I will make sure that we fully cover that.
Okay.
Okay. Now, I again want to point out that, where are we here? Okay. From slide 32 forward, you're not responsible for. So you're only responsible for slides 1 through 31. Okay. Bella, you had a question? That's not. Okay. All right. Any other questions about this before we move on to general questions about the class?
Are we gonna? Is the exam gonna be on all 4 PowerPoints in Module 3?
Yes.
We're gonna get through them all by the end of class Thursday?
Yes. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So if you don't have any questions about this, right, in order for us to get through all of those, I'm going to take the remaining time and we're going to get started with number 8. Okay. All right. So let's move over here now. And by the way, I've also given you some extra videos for you to watch as well. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started with number 8. All right. Okay. Okay. All right. So with that in mind, let's come over here. We will get started. And away we go. All right, so now we're going to look at scheduling, okay? So we're going to skip the learning objectives on this because you can go back and take a look at them on your own, all right? And as you can do with the outline. So let's talk about what we're looking at or why this is important for us as far as the resources are important. Just like you have to schedule your time, you have to schedule your resources as well. If you don't, then you run the risk of not having adequate resources, right? This is the don't count your chickens before the eggs hatch kind of thing, all right? Now that network diagram helps you to do that. And the reason why you build a network diagram is because it allows you to project the times and the amount of money that you will need until you have completion. The project network is not a schedule and are not scheduled until you've actually assigned the resources. What I mean by that is until you've allocated the people and until you've allocated the money to get it done, your network diagram will tell you the time, but it won't actually be a full network diagram. What you have so far is fine, and we're just working on the times. But in a full network diagram, you notice that when you had your software, it asked you who's going to be responsible and how much. That's added in there too, okay? And cost estimates are not a budget until they've actually been time phased. Now, you put those two together and it tells you the time is not complete until the money's there, and the budget is not complete until the time's there. And so it shows you that each of them goes together. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, here are some issues that you have to think about. One of them is, how do we smooth out what we need? You don't want to have all of your resources piling in on you at one time because you won't have anywhere to store them, right? You won't have anywhere to put the money, the resources, the lumber if you're building a shed, or the steel if you're building a building, or any of those things, right? When you have resource constrained scheduling, it is an attempt for you to be able to say, we're not going to be able to do this project until a certain piece comes in. Building a house, for example, you have to have the foundation done before anything else, and you have to have the concrete done for the foundation. And so this is what we look at as resource constrained scheduling. Everything revolves around getting that concrete to the house. All right, so now some of the different project constraints other than the resources are technical or logical constraints. You can't do this until you do that, or we don't have the technology to get that done. Maybe you have physical constraints. Right now we're facing a major physical constraint, as in we don't have enough beds for all of the patients who are coming down with COVID-19, right? Just before class, Isabella Bourne was telling me how they are turning the convention center into a makeshift hospital, right? So hopefully they can get that done sooner rather than later. Right now they have the physical constraint. They don't have enough respirators. They don't have enough of any of those things. So that then becomes a resource constraint, right? So if you have an absence or shortage of something that's unique and necessary, that becomes a resource constraint, okay? Somebody have a question?
I have one question.
Yep.
Where's like all the money come to like fund these kind of emergencies like Corona?
So that's a very good question. And it's especially good since we just talked about risk management. So there are three sources. First, hopefully, state, local, and federal governments have developed some sort of contingency plan so that they have a little bit extra to begin with. Second is that they can issue debt, right? So right now, for instance, the $2 trillion of extra money that we're using to pay for all of this came in the source of the US government issuing debt. Now that debt gets filtered out into the American people who will buy up bonds. That debt gets filtered out into other countries who can buy up our bonds as well. And the third way that you can fund this is just to write a check. The US government can actually print its own money, and as a result, it can say, look, this is the way it is. Now, the problem with the third option is a huge one, because if you just issue money, then you devalue the money you already have, right? And so devaluing the currency would have repercussions, and so we don't want to do that. So the state and local governments had reserves that they're using and they're having to tap into, especially the state of Florida, right? The state of Florida had about $100 million that they could tap into, but that's not going to be enough. So the next thing is that they'll issue debt in the form of bonds, right? That's what the federal government is doing. And hopefully we won't have to do the third option, because that would be a major, major catastrophe. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Same way you do. You have an emergency fund. If that doesn't work, what do? You put it on your credit card. And if those two don't work, what can you do? You write a check, but you don't have the money in the bank, so it's a bad check, right? So that's why we don't want to do that third option. Got it?
Yeah, but it's like kind of confusing because, like, you know, the streets in New Orleans are so bad, and it's been like that for so many years. It's like, how can you not fix the streets but then have all this money to, like, you know, I guess the streets aren't like a life or death situation, but
I totally get it, right? I totally get it, right? I used to live in Louisiana too. I know how bad the roads are. I know how bad the streets are. Crumbling infrastructure, like some of the bridges and whatever, need to be fixed, and they need to fix that stuff sooner rather than later, but they're just not getting it done. So, right? All right, so let's move on, right? These are just examples of what the constraints would be. So, for instance, a technical constraint would be, let's say you're building a shed again, right? So, from start to finish, you have to pour the concrete, frame the building, put the roof on. You can't do them unless you do them in that order. So that's a technical constraint. Your resource constraints, okay? Okay, so when you guys are asking questions, make sure you remute your mic. Remember, we are recording this for other classes, okay? So your resource constraints will be, all right, we're gonna make our plan, but until we purchase the refreshments, decorate the hall, and hire the band, we're not actually gonna have a reception, right? So this is what we mean by that, okay? Now, how do we power through this? The first thing we do is we want to classify the problem. That priority matrix that we mentioned in the previous chapter will help us do this, right? So classification, what's important, what's not. The next thing is we look at the time constraints. Time is fixed. It's the one thing that you cannot really get more of. It is by far your most important constraint. Let me say that one more time. Time is by far your most important constraint, because you ain't making more of it. You don't have any more time to get things done. And so time is by far your most important constraint. All right? Okay. Now, let's take a look at the next one. This is when we look at resource constrained projects. This is when the resources are fixed, but the time is flexible. And so we end up with inadequate resources, right? Inadequate resources that certainly delay the project. I just had a roof put on my house last week, right? Wonderful roof, great roof, best roof ever, right? But if they didn't have the shingles, it doesn't matter what time it gets there. At that point, it doesn't matter, because you can get there at 7:30, you can get started, and there's no shingles. You're not going to be able to work. You might as well leave and go somewhere else, okay? All right. Now, there are a couple of different ways that we can look at how we are some of the assumptions that we make, all right? The first is called limiting assumptions. And a limiting assumption is when you have to split the activity, or when you look at different activities and you can't split it up. Once you start, it has to be carried to completion. Like you can't start pouring concrete for a foundation on a house and then stop and come back the next day. It has to be finished in that day. Otherwise, it ruins the whole thing, right? So that's a limiting assumption. A risk assumption is when you look at anything that has, when you look at the risk events and you say, okay, we're going to look at the one with the least risk. That thing here, so Cole, you asked me about stars. See where it says activities with the most slack pose the least risk? That's something you need to put a star by, okay? All right, activities with the most slack produce the least risk, or pose the least risk. Now let's invert that, flip it around. Activities with the least slack pose the most risk, right? In other words, the ones that are on the critical path are the most risky. They're the most sensitive to change. So risk and sensitivity are together. All right, I'll go back over that again. when we're reviewing for the test. All right, so on slide 811, activities with the most slack pose the least risk. All right. Another is the time constrained project. What is the most important constraint? What's the
Time.
most important? Time. Good job. Why? Because you ain't making no more of it. You don't have more hours in the day. You don't have more days in the month.
Now unless
You
we
have
get a
to
time
figure it
machine.
out. That'd be awesome. If you do that, if you invent a time machine, I want you to go back in time to the moment that whatever that Chinese person was that got COVID-19, tell them to stop whatever they're doing so that it doesn't spread.
I thought you say if
Right?
we make a time machine, you would give us an A in the class.
I probably would. I'll give you an A. For a time machine, I would definitely give you an A. Sound like a plan?
Yep.
All right. How are we going to know if it works, though?
Testing.
How?
So
How would you test a time machine?
get somebody who doesn't care about living and put them in there.
So how far in advance do you have to go for me to say that this worked? Okay. All right. We need to get through this slide, and then we're going to call it a day. So let's look at time-constrained projects. Again, time is the most important constraint. And so a time-constrained project is one that absolutely positively has to be done on time. Your final project has to be done before the last day of class because my grades are due and they're not going to let me slide. So you have a time-imposed or time-constrained project that's due, all right? This, now you will have to try to level out the time and balance it out so you make sure that everybody gets everything done. And hopefully you have some positive slack, right? That means that you can then have your resource utilization over the entire duration of the project to be able to smooth that out so that you don't have to worry so much about last minute details. You got me? Okay. All right, so we're going to ignore that. That's not important, right? Let me see where we are here. Okay, so 2 more slides and we'll call it a day. Got it? Here's where I want to be. All right, so when you're looking at your resource leveling or resource allocations, right? When you are leveling out your time-constrained project, the advantages are that the peak demand is reduced, resources are reduced, and fluctuations are minimized. Main disadvantage is loss of flexibility and an increase in the criticality or the critical nature of all the activities. Got it? All right. Last slide for the day is resource constrained projects are limited in quantity or availability. This happens when you have limited quantities or availabilities, right? You don't have enough concrete, you don't have enough steel, you don't have enough, I don't know, you don't have enough respirators. And so because of that, you have to come up with another plan. Usually you come up with what's called heuristics or rules of thumb, right? So here's what you look at. Those ones you look at are the ones that have the minimum slack, the least duration, and the lowest activity number, right? So what do I mean by that? When you're having a resource constrained project, the ones with the minimum slack get done first. The ones with the smallest duration get done first. And the ones with the lowest activity number get done first. This allows you to get more pieces of the puzzle done. Okay? Think of it like this. If you only have a certain amount of resources, you'd rather have more smaller pieces of the project done rather than one big project. That way, all of those pieces are sitting there and they're ready to go. You have more of it done, therefore you're more likely to get it done on time. Okay? And the way you do that is what's called the parallel method, which you don't have to be responsible for. All right, so let me get through this and I'll tell you where we're going to end up, right? So somebody remind me when we come back together on Thursday that we're going to look at slide 8-22 on the EMR project, right? Actually, I don't think I want to deal with this at all. Yeah, so we don't have to do that. So let's start with 8-30 on splitting when we come back together. Okay? All right. Courtney, you got that? Slide 8-30. And if she doesn't, I know Cole does. Right? Okay. All right. Any last minute questions? Good job, Janice. Thank you. Right?
Wait, Joe, can I ask about?
Yes.
It doesn't have to be. Okay. So since you mentioned that classes are going to be online for the